She came over with champagne before I even got the email. I want you to sit with that for a second. My friend, his daughter, showed up at my door with a bottle of something, absolutely glowing, telling me how excited she was for me. And I hadn't heard a word. The offer hadn't come through yet. She knew before I did. I remember what I wore to that interview. It was in a coffee shop. It was casual. He and I had always hit it off. He was wealthy, a well-connected local CEO, the kind of man who filled a room without trying. I'd known him through her for a little while. He made you feel like you were exactly where you were supposed to be. The conversation was easy. I left thinking, yeah, that went well. And then she showed up with the champagne. And I felt it. That little pull in my stomach. The one your body does when it's trying to tell you something that your brain isn't ready to hear yet. I looked at her face. She was so happy, so certain. And I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was self-sabotaging, that this was a good thing, and I needed to accept it as a good thing. He's going to take such good care of you. That was the promise. And I let it override everything else. The salary was laughable. I knew it the second I saw it. It was less than I was already making. And I didn't argue. I didn't ask a single hard question. What was in scope? Whether raises were written into the contract? What the actual trajectory of the role looked like? I didn't ask any of it. Because I didn't want to seem ungrateful. And they clearly wanted me. And if someone wants you, you don't negotiate that. You accept it. You stay grateful. You trust that the people in your corner are going to take care of things that you can't see yet. That's what I believed. That is what I did. My scope turned out to be vast in ways nobody told me. Schedules, fundraisers, lavish ones that required logistics I wasn't hired to manage. At one point, I wrote and produced an entire Christmas play. I became the unofficial therapist to most of the staff after he offended them, the person they came to metabolize what they couldn't say directly, the catch-all for everything nobody else wanted to hold. After a year, I took stock. I looked at what I was doing, what I was being paid, and what my stress levels were doing to my body. And then I asked for a raise. And he laughed. Not a dismissive little chuckle. He laughed. And in that moment, I knew exactly where I stood. The purse he'd brought back from Cuba, from a street vendor, I think, or maybe the airport. I was never quite sure. That was the ceiling of what they were going to give me. A gift. A gesture. Something that said, I see you, without actually costing anything. I left on good terms. I'm not bitter about it. But before I walked out the door, I put a clause in my separation agreement. If they ever needed my help in the future, there would be a consulting fee. Any text, any phone call, an hour of my time, billable. By the end, I had the language and the leverage. I just hadn't had it at the beginning. And the whole thing could have looked completely different if I had. I'm Sarah Caminiti, and this is episode 6 of the Career Strategist. Last week I told you something I want you to carry into this episode. You are not there to be chosen. You are there to choose. And to let them make their case. They have to earn your yes, too. That's the mindset shift. Stop auditioning. Start investigating. But here's the thing that I didn't give you yet. The investigation requires a framework. Surprise! It requires knowing what you're looking for because you can walk into a room with the right posture, curious, clear, genuinely evaluating, and still miss everything if you don't know how to read what's in front of you. What I'm going to give you today is the intelligence gathering infrastructure, the authority test, the room color lens applied directly to interviews, the questions that don't sound like tests but absolutely are. And I'm going to show you what it looks like when a room fails the test and when you walk away anyway. The friend's dad story is what happens when you don't have any of this, when you let someone else's excitement override your gut, when you step into a power dynamic before you assessed it. And by the time you understand it, it's already locked. By the end of this episode, you will have it from the beginning. Let's start with something that took me a long time to fully accept. How they respond to your authority in the interview is exactly how they'll respond if you take the job. I don't mean authority in the loud, chest-forward sense. I mean the quiet kind. The kind where you say something with conviction and see what happens. Where you articulate a standard, something you need to do your best work, and watch whether they lean in or pull back. Where you push back gently on something you actually disagree with and observe whether the energy shifts. That reaction is not interview behavior, it's organizational behavior. A preview, not a performance. They are showing you the actual culture of that room before you've signed anything. So let's just call this what it is. It's an authority test. And it works on a simple premise. People who are comfortable with confident, opinionated collaborators will engage with your authority. They'll ask follow-up questions. They'll push back thoughtfully. They'll tell you where they've struggled and why. They'll be curious about what you think instead of managing what you show them. People who expect compliance will react differently. They'll get slightly stiff when you push back. They'll redirect. They'll answer your question with enthusiasm about how great the culture is. They won't be hostile. In fact, they'll probably be perfectly lovely. But the warmth will have a ceiling, and you'll feel it. That ceiling is the job. So here's how you run the authority test. Don't start with a confrontation. Please, do not start with a confrontation. You have to start by establishing expertise. You make statements about what you know and how you work, not as credentials to impress them, but as conditions for your best work. The structure looks like this. Expertise first, then strategic reasoning, then environmental needs framed as success conditions. Not, I prefer environments where I have autonomy. That sounds like a personal preference. And they'll smile and say, of course. I mean, who doesn't? Instead, say, I found that the best outcomes come from people who are close to the work, having real decision-making input. That's how I approach team leadership. I invest time understanding the obstacles at the ground level, not just tracking deliverables. In my experience, that kind of ground-up insight drives better results, but it requires leadership that is genuinely curious about employee experience and values strategic input over compliance. Read the room after that. Some people will lean forward. Tell me more about how you've done that. What does that look like in practice? We've been trying to build that. Here is where we've run into trouble. Yeah, those are green signals. Other people will smile and say, oh, we really value that here. Our culture is very collaborative. And then they'll move on to the next question. That second response is not a bad person. It may not even be a conscious deflection, but it is telling you something. They heard your statement as something to reassure you about, not something to engage with. That's a yellow signal at the minimum. I want to tell you what happens when you run the authority test and the room fails it immediately. I made it through 3 rounds with the company. Third round, I'm talking to a C-suite executive, someone who would have been above me in the structure. He was explaining the company's challenges, what they needed to fix, the state of things, and then he said it casually, half joking, except he wasn't joking at all. We're probably just going to need to fire everybody and start over. My stomach dropped. Not from shock at the boldness of it, from recognition. This was not a frustrated exaggeration in a venting moment. This was a man telling me what he expected from whoever he hired. I did the uncomfortable laugh, the kind you do when your brain is buying time because your body already knows, but you just don't have the words yet. And then I said, I have an ethical problem with that. I understand there's a lot that needs to change, but I don't think getting rid of everybody is the right approach. He started to backpedal. We both knew the interview was over. I did not make it to round 4. Darn. And here is what I want you to hear about that. If I had laughed along, if I had nodded and said, yeah, sometimes you've got to make those big structural changes. If I had performed agreement to get to the next round, they would have expected me to fire everybody. That was not a throwaway comment. That was the job description, delivered without the paperwork. And I had just been handed the most important information of the entire interview process by someone who didn't even realize that he was giving it to me. My discomfort didn't cost me the job. It saved me from it. That's the authority test in its most complete form. You speak with conviction. They show you who they are, and then you make a decision with real data instead of hope. But I got to tell you something important before we go any further. I did everything right once. I told the person hiring me explicitly, do not hire me if you expect me to spend my time convincing this company that my function matters. They assured me that wasn't the case. I took the job, so proud of myself for making these things very clear. And it turned out to be the worst bait and switch of my entire career. The strategic role I was promised became babysitting, at best. The resources I was told were coming never came. The values they performed in the interview did not survive contact with the actual culture. You can do everything right. You can ask the hard questions, you can run the authority test, you can read the room correctly and still get lied to. That's not a failure of your framework. That's just a failure of their integrity. And it's important that you hear me say that because I don't want you walking away from this episode thinking that the right questions make you bulletproof. They don't. What they do is improve your odds dramatically, and just as importantly, they give you faster clarity when things go wrong. You recognize the bait and switch sooner. You stop blaming yourself for someone else's dishonesty, and you leave with your sense of reality intact instead of spending months wondering if you were the problem. Now, let's talk about how you read the room before you ever run the authority test, because by the time you're in that third round conversation, you should already have a working hypothesis. In episode 2, we talked about room colors, green, yellow, and red, as a way to map the environments you're moving through. I want to apply that lens directly to the interview process because the signals are there from the first conversation if you know how to look for them. The green room interview feels like a conversation. They answer your questions with specificity, real examples, real problems they've wrestled with, real things they're still figuring out. They don't perform culture at you. They don't get stiff when you ask something pointed. You leave the interview knowing more about the actual environment than you did walking in. A yellow room interview is enthusiastic and vague. They love your skills. They're very excited about what you could bring. But when you ask how success gets measured in this role, you get generalities. When you ask about the review process, you get warmth without structure. When you ask about difficult conversations, they tell you about the family feeling and the open door policy, and then they pivot. The posture changes subtly when you go off script. They're selling the job harder than they're describing it. A red room interview is uncomfortable with you. Not hostile, uncomfortable. When you ask about how feedback works, they get slightly defensive, like the question implies an accusation. When you ask for an example of a hard conversation they've navigated, they can't produce one, or they give you an answer that's entirely about how the other person was wrong. When you speak with conviction about your expertise, something in them closes. They want someone who will fit, which in red room language means someone who will not ask these questions at all. Let me give you the question that tells you the most, the fastest. How do you navigate difficult conversations here? Not, do you have difficult conversations? Because, of course, they'll say yes. I mean, at least I would hope they would say yes. Big red flag if they say no. No, instead, ask how. A green answer gives you an example, a very specific one. It describes someone who disagreed, what happened, and how the disagreement got resolved, and what changed afterwards. The person telling you this sounds like they've done it recently. They might even tell you that it went badly at first. The texture of the answer is real. A red answer gives you a value statement. We really believe in directness here. We have an open door policy. We're like a family. We always work things out. You may get a story, but the story will be about how they were right and the other person eventually came around. Nobody in the story was uncomfortable for long. There is no friction in the resolution because the whole answer is designed to reassure you that friction doesn't exist. Those two answers will tell you more about a company's actual culture than everything else in the interview combined. And you can ask that same question at every stage in the interview process because odds are you are going to be encountering different people every time. Now, I want to show you what yellow room signals look like in practice. The ones that are harder to see because they sound reasonable. I took a role once at a bootstrapped company that needed someone to build out the CX function. I needed out of where I was. That was my first mistake, walking in with urgency that I hadn't examined, because when you're desperate to leave, your ability to read the room gets compromised. You start explaining away the signals instead of cataloging them. They told me there was a very specific universal pay structure. Everyone's salary was effectively public. You could see what people made. At first, that sounded like great transparency. It sounded like exactly what I'd said I'd value. But I should have asked, can I see the spreadsheet? I should have asked, how do you get raises? How often are the tiers updated? When was the last time? Who manages the budget for specific teams? Yeah, I didn't ask any of that. The other signal I should have caught, almost everyone at the company was a contractor, not full-time. Only a handful of FTEs. I've been learning since then how many countries have very specific legal requirements around contractor classification, and how many companies aren't following them. That concentration of contractors wasn't a business model detail. It was a power structure detail. It told me where they were investing and where they weren't. Both of those signals were in the room during the interview. I just didn't have the questions ready to surface them. Your intelligence gathering has to be active. Signals don't announce themselves. You have to ask for the specificity that makes them visible. Here's what I wish I had asked that CEO, my friend's dad, before I said yes. What is actually in scope for this role and what isn't? If the answer's vague, oh, it's wide-ranging, you'll be involved in all kinds of things. That's not flattering. That's a warning. Vague scope means your scope will be decided by whatever needs doing on any given day. If I'm taking a pay cut, what does the compensation trajectory look like? And can we write that into the agreement? That question is not presumptuous. It's rational. Any reasonable employer should be able to answer it. What does success in this role look like in 12 months from your perspective specifically? And this is the one I should have asked myself before I ever walked into that coffee shop. Do I actually need this job? Or do I want the version of it that I've been sold? Because I didn't need it. I had a job. I wasn't desperate. I got swept up in someone else's certainty, my friend's excitement, her father's warmth, the feeling of being chosen, and I let that override the pull in my stomach that showed up the moment she knocked on my door with that bottle. I'm glad I took that role. I'll tell you that clearly. It dismantled a fear I'd been carrying for most of my career. This idea that people at a certain level of wealth and power were operating in a fundamentally different category from me. They are not. CEOs are people. Some of them are brilliant. Some of them are careless. Some of them will laugh at you when you ask for a raise. The power is real, but it is not magic. And once you've sat across from enough of them and seen them as human beings making human choices, you stop behaving differently around them. That was worth something. That really was worth a lot. But I didn't evaluate him. I let someone else's excitement speak for me. And the terms of that relationship got set in that coffee shop conversation, before the champagne, before the offer, before any of it. Because I never ran the authority test. I never asked the questions. I never gave him the opportunity to show me who he actually was. By the time I understood what take care of you actually meant in practice, the dynamic was already locked. Here are the 3 practices for this week. Practice 1. Write down 3 questions you would ask if you weren't afraid to seem difficult. Not the questions that you've already memorized, not the ones designed to demonstrate interest. The ones you actually want answered. The ones you've been softening or skipping because you were worried about the impression they'd make. What would it take for you to not succeed in this role? How are compensation decisions made and who makes them? What does a hard conversation between you and the person in this seat look like? Write them down. Practice saying them out loud. Not because you're going to deliver them like interrogation, but because the act of writing them will show you what you've been leaving unasked. Practice 2. Before your next interview, name the specific authority signal you're going to watch for. Not a vague intention to read the room, a specific test. Maybe it's, I'm going to make one definitive statement about how I work and watch whether they engage with it or manage it. Maybe it's, I'm going to ask about difficult conversations and listen for whether the answer has texture. Pick one signal. Watch for it specifically and write down what you observed after. You're building a database. Every interview is another data point. Practice 3. Go back to a role you took where the signs were there and you explained them away. We all have at least one. You don't have to have perfect recall. Just pull up whatever you can. What was the thing that didn't sit right? What did you tell yourself about it? What did it turn out to actually mean? This practice is not about beating yourself up for past decisions. It's about sharpening your pattern recognition for the next one. The signals you ignored then are probably the signals you'll see most clearly going forward because your body already knows them. You're just giving your brain the language to keep up. I want to come back to where I started today. The consulting fee clause, the separation agreement, the thing I built for myself on the way out that I didn't have when I walked in. That clause wasn't bitterness, it wasn't retaliation, it was precision. It was me finally saying, this is what my time is worth. This is how this relationship works from here. And I only had the clarity to do that because at the end of the role, I understood the actual dynamics of what had been happening. That's the version of you I want you to become before you accept. Not after. Before. The difference between those two positions is exactly what this season is about. The work in episode 1, knowing who you are before they try to tell you. The power dynamics from episode 2, understanding how rooms get established and held. The values precision from episode 3, so you know what a violation actually costs. The strategic frameworks from episode 4, so you're making decisions instead of reacting to them. Last week, stopping the audition so you can actually investigate. And now this. The intelligence to run the test, to read the room in real time, to ask the questions that aren't on the list, to trust the pull in your stomach the way you trust your own name. You don't need the consulting fee clause. You need what it represents. The knowledge of your own value before you walk in the door. Next week, we go to the number. Now that you know how to evaluate the room, how to test the authority, how to read whether the environment will support or suppress who you are, next week, we talk about what happens when they make you an offer. What happens when that number comes. Because knowing your worth in the abstract is one thing. Saying it out loud in a room where someone is watching your face, that's a different skill entirely. And it is absolutely learnable. That's episode 7. Salary negotiation gets its own full episode because it deserves one. I'm Sarah Caminiti. This is the Career Strategist. You are capable of so much more than you realize. And I can't wait to see you next week.